In 43 AD, Emperor Claudius sent 4 legions across the English Channel and set foot on British soil. Textbooks call this moment the dividing line between civilization and barbarism, the starting point of history. But if you look closely at the evidence, you will find that the logic of this story is completely backwards. Rome did not conquer Britain in 43 AD. What they actually did was deliver an invoice for a lifestyle the Britons had already chosen for themselves. This is not a metaphor. This is what archaeology has been proving with physical objects over the past 2 decades. Before we go any further, consider one number, from 800 BC to 43 AD, that is nearly 900 years. In those 900 years, what happened between Britain and the Mediterranean world was far more complicated than any invasion or conquest. We know this largely because of a new set of tools: stable isotope analysis, ancient DNA sequencing, Bayesian statistical dating, and LiDAR scanning. These technologies allowed archaeologists, for the first time, to track the movement of objects, people, and ideas with extraordinary precision. What they found completely changed our understanding of what 43 AD actually meant. The story begins with a mystery. In ancient Greek and Phoenician texts, there is a place name that keeps appearing, the Cassiterides, which literally means the Tin Islands. This place had enormous deposits of tin, one of the most critical raw materials in the Bronze Age Mediterranean world. But nobody would tell you where it was. Not because they did not know. Because they did not want you to know. Phoenician merchants and later Carthaginian traders treated the Atlantic sailing routes north of the Strait of Gibraltar as a core commercial secret. If your competitors did not know where the tin came from, you could monopolize that supply line forever. Barry Cunliffe at Oxford, who spent years studying these ancient texts, concluded that the geographic vagueness surrounding the Tin Islands was entirely deliberate. Keeping trade routes profitable required keeping geographic knowledge opaque. This is the essential insight that runs through this entire story. Knowledge about Britain was never neutral. Whoever controlled information about Britain controlled a form of power. In the 6th century BC, Greek settlers founded the colony of Massalia, which is modern-day Marseille, on the southern coast of France. Merchants from that city produced what are now the earliest known systematic accounts of Britain. Those original texts have long been lost, but their contents were preserved inside a poem written in the 4th century AD by the Roman poet Avienus, titled Aura Maritima. That poem mentions 2 islands, one called Albion and one called Erne, corresponding to Britain and Ireland. In 2021, a research team at the University of Edinburgh applied a method called textual stratification analysis to this poem, and found that its core geographic information does trace back to genuine observations made in the 5th century BC, even though later editors buried it under layers of mythological language. Around 325 BC, a navigator from Massalia named Pytheas set out on a journey that would take him north along the Atlantic coastline. He wrote a book about it called On the Ocean. The original is lost, but enough of it was quoted by later geographers including Strabo, Diodorus, and Pliny that we can reconstruct a surprisingly detailed picture. Pytheas was the first Mediterranean scholar to look at Britain with systematic eyes. He did not just sketch the coastline. He described how the locals stored their grain. Because the climate was so wet, they kept it in underground chambers rather than open threshing floors. He wrote about how the British extracted a drink from grain, which is very possibly the earliest recorded reference to British beer. He observed local astronomical practices and noted how ritual activities were connected to the movement of celestial bodies. He even described a place he called Thule, located 6 days sailing north of Britain, where the sun barely sets. He was clearly describing the midnight sun at high latitudes around the summer solstice. Where exactly Thule was is still debated. Icelandic scholars argue for Iceland. Norwegian archaeologists point to the central Norwegian coast. Others favor the Shetland Islands. The dispute remains open, but the very fact that scholars take it seriously tells you something important. The geographic detail in Pytheas was specific enough to be worth arguing about. Then Strabo shut the whole conversation down. In his geography, Strabo called Pytheas a habitual liar and expressed systematic distrust of everything he wrote. This hostility had a real effect on how information about Britain traveled through Roman elite culture. The Finnish scholar Jaakko Arjava applied computational linguistics to the passages where Strabo quotes Pytheas, trying to separate what Pythias actually said from what Strabo added in commentary. The results showed that Strabo's criticisms were sometimes fair, but more often ideologically driven. A Greek merchant from Massalia simply did not carry much credibility inside the Roman knowledge hierarchy. That is the political reality of ancient information. Whether people believed what you said depended not just on whether you were right, but on who you were. Now, let us look at the physical evidence. Archaeologists excavating sites in Exeter and Dorset in southwestern England have pulled up large quantities of Italian amphorae, the ceramic vessels Romans used to transport wine, olive oil, and fish sauce. Residue analysis has confirmed that these goods were already appearing at elite British feasting sites around 100 BC, nearly 150 years before the Claudian invasion. The fish sauce is worth pausing on. The Roman version was called garum. It was made by fermenting fish entrails in salt, and the result was an intensely pungent liquid condiment, something like Southeast Asian fish sauce today, but considerably more aggressive. Along the Mediterranean coast, this was everyday food. In Britain, it was a pure luxury import. Using garum at your feast was a way of announcing one thing: I have a connection to the Roman world that you do not have. And it was not just Exeter. At Camulodunum, which is modern Colchester, and at Verulamium, which is modern St. Albans, excavated layers dated between the 20th BC and 20 AD contained Italian tableware from the Augustan period, Mediterranean amphora, and high-quality metalwork from Gaul, all piled together. Among the ceramics was a type called Aretine ware, produced in the Italian city of Arezzo. It was the most refined tableware of the early Roman Empire, a distinctive red gloss finish with molded relief decoration. Finding this in British elite burials tells you its value was not just practical. It was symbolic. Those imported luxury goods were intensely concentrated in elite spaces, feasts and high-status burials. At Verulamium, a series of high-prestige graves dated between the 20th BC and 20 AD contained a specific combination of objects: Roman imported drinking vessels, Mediterranean perfume bottles, and locally made luxury goods, all placed together. The archaeologist Ros Niblet, who has directed excavations at this site for many years, described this pattern as a hybrid elite identity. The point is simple: you cannot describe these people using a single category of either native or Roman. They were actors who moved deliberately between two symbolic systems. Local leaders had figured out that monopolizing objects from the Mediterranean could create a very particular kind of authority in internal power competitions. If you could drink what others could not drink, if you could use what others could not use, you possessed a form of exotic knowledge, and that knowledge was a genuine political resource. Then there is something even more striking found at Silchester. Archaeologists there uncovered two types of ceramics called terra rubra and terra nigra, which translate as red earth and black earth. These vessels were shaped exactly like elite Roman tableware, flat-bottomed plates, stemmed cups. But the clay was local. They were fired in local kilns. They were imitations of imports. What does this mean? It means that ordinary households who could not afford the real imported goods had started copying Roman eating habits anyway. They changed how food was served, moving away from a communal pot shared by everyone toward individual portions on separate dishes. This shift happened quietly, without any soldiers, without any political decision. It just spread over decades and reshaped the logic of daily life from the ground up. There is one more layer of evidence worth mentioning. LiDAR technology, which uses laser pulses to penetrate vegetation and map microtopography with extraordinary precision, has identified in southeastern England a large number of late prehistoric settlement sites and road networks that were previously completely unknown. The distribution of these newly discovered sites shows consistent spatial relationships with known pre-Roman power centers, which is forcing scholars to completely redraw the political geography of pre-conquest Britain. Many places we assumed were empty wilderness turn out to have had dense, complex settlement patterns. In the 55th BC, Caesar crossed the Channel for the first time. He brought 2 legions, roughly 10,000 men, and landed on the coast of Kent. He immediately ran into problems. His cavalry transport ships were wrecked by storms and never made it across. Worse, the local population could see that the heavy Roman ships could not get close to the shallow beaches, and they attacked the moment the soldiers jumped into chest-deep water and tried to wade ashore. Caesar describes this moment in his Gallic Wars: the standard-bearer of the 10th Legion jumped into the sea alone and shouted something to the effect of "Jump in and follow me," or "Watch the eagle fall into enemy hands." That rallied the troops. The detail got repeated endlessly by later Roman historians and became an icon of imperial courage. But the entire first expedition accomplished almost nothing and withdrew. The second expedition in the 54th BC was far larger, 5 legions, 2,000 cavalry, around 30,000 fighting men, and 800 ships. This time they pushed deep inland, crossed the Thames, and defeated the tribal confederation led by Cassivellaunus. His strategy was guerrilla style. He dismissed most of his infantry and kept only 4,000 chariots as a mobile harassing force, constantly attacking the Roman column while refusing pitched battle, and moving all livestock and civilians into dense forest. Caesar recorded the British chariot tactics in detail. They would drive at the enemy line, throw javelins to create chaos, jump off and fight on foot, then remount and withdraw to the flanks while the drivers waited nearby for extraction. The flexibility of this method made Roman cavalry essentially useless. The final outcome was a negotiated settlement. Cassivellaunus promised annual tribute and handed over hostages, and Caesar withdrew. Did anyone follow through on that promise? No. The scholar Susan Hingley at Cambridge has pointed out that the tribute commitment was abandoned almost immediately after Caesar left, and there is no evidence it was ever regularly paid. So what did these two expeditions actually leave behind? Caesar never invaded Britain. What he invaded was the Roman Senate's imagination of Britain, and he won that campaign completely. The island was just the prop. The French scholar Fleury published an analysis in 2022 comparing the grammatical structures Caesar uses to describe Britain versus Gaul. He found a consistent pattern. Britain is always framed as slightly more barbaric than Gaul, but never so barbaric as to be beyond Roman ordering. The calibration was deliberate. Just barbaric enough to justify intervention, but not so barbaric as to be ungovernable, because an ungovernable territory has no value as a conquest. This rhetoric was engineered for a Roman political audience. It was not geography. It was marketing. Caesar also writes something else worth noticing. He says that before planning the invasion, he sent envoys to British tribal leaders asking for information, and got almost nothing back. For a long time scholars read this as rhetorical cover for a poorly prepared campaign. But recent readings flip the interpretation. Perhaps the Britons genuinely refused to share information, because they already understood what Rome was planning and had the political intelligence to choose silence. There is one figure from the Caesar period whose story almost perfectly summarizes the complexity of the entire pre-conquest era. His name was Commius, and he was a leader of the Atrebates tribe. During the Gallic Wars, he had been one of Caesar's collaborators, helping manage his tribal territory on Rome's behalf. When Caesar decided to invade Britain, he sent Commius ahead as an envoy to persuade the British tribes. Commius arrived in Britain and was immediately arrested. He was not released until Caesar's army actually landed. After that, his trajectory became increasingly tangled. He rejoined Caesar, then participated in the Pan-Gallic uprising, led by Vercingetorix, the chieftain who was eventually taken back to Rome, paraded through the city, and executed. When that revolt failed, Commius fled to Britain and built himself a political base there. A numismatic research team at University College London catalogued more than 300 coins stamped with the letters Calm, and used them to map the extent of his rule across a wide area of southern Britain. Those coins prove he was not a refugee. He was a successful political architect. Commius carried 3 identities simultaneously: Roman collaborator, anti-Roman rebel, and British territorial ruler. No single label can contain him. After Caesar's assassination, Augustus took control of the Roman world and made a choice that was completely unlike anything Caesar would have done. He decided not to invade Britain. This was not because he did not want it. The poets Horace, Virgil, and Propertius all wrote verses about conquering Britain, framing it as one of the great glories still awaiting the Augustan age, which created a persistent cultural pressure to act. But Augustus ran a cold cost-benefit calculation. Direct military occupation was too expensive. Diplomatic penetration could achieve almost the same result. Strabo records in his geography that during the Augustan period, British tribal leaders were already traveling to Rome to offer gifts and perform ceremonies on the Capitoline Hill. Strabo also notes that through customs duties alone, Rome was already extracting revenue from British trade equivalent to what direct rule would have generated through taxation. In other words, from a purely financial perspective, it did not matter whether you conquered the place or not. The money was already flowing. Strabo even did the arithmetic on the military cost of invading Britain and concluded it was not worth it. The expense of maintaining a garrison would exceed whatever taxes the territory could produce. Augustus applied this logic rigorously. He planned to invade Britain 3 times and abandoned the plan 3 times, each time because a more urgent crisis somewhere else on the frontier pulled his attention away. But not invading did not mean not intervening. What Augustus built instead was a sophisticated client-king system. Identify the right local elites, support them, and let them serve as on-the-ground transmission points for Roman influence. These leaders received Roman diplomatic recognition, sometimes sent their sons to Rome to be educated, and returned home carrying Roman administrative thinking and cultural symbols as tools of domestic authority. The system worked well, right up until it started producing instability. In the half-century after Caesar's expeditions, something remarkable happened in the numismatic record of southern Britain. Local rulers began putting Latin script on their coins at scale. Tatiavanus, the leader of the Catuvellauni tribe, stamped his gold coins with the word rex, which is Latin for king. Stop and think about that for a moment. Latin was not a common language in Britain at this time. Ordinary people could not read it. So who was this word written for? It was written for anyone who might have contact with the Roman world. It was a business card written in Rome's language. The imagery he chose included the head of Apollo, griffins, and centaurs, standard Roman visual vocabulary. His successor Cyanobelin went even further. His coins borrowed deeply from the visual grammar of Augustan Roman currency: ears of wheat, grapevines, mounted riders. The entire symbolic system was effectively transplanted. John Creighton at Oxford spent years studying this body of coinage and reached a clear conclusion: this was not imitation. It was translation. More precisely, it was strategic symbolic appropriation. Cyanobelin minting coins in the style of Augustus was not submission. It was the oldest political trick available: dress like the most powerful person in the room and let everyone assume you belong there. The logic operated on 2 levels simultaneously. Toward the Roman world, these coins broadcast a signal: we are people you can negotiate with, we speak your visual language, we are worthy of diplomatic relationship. Toward the domestic audience, they said something different: I have a special relationship with the Roman Empire, and that relationship is my exclusive source of authority. The UCL numismatics team catalogued more than 300 coins associated with the Cyanobelin family in 2019, and used them to map his political reach across a wide zone in southeastern Britain. That physical record transformed Cyanobelin from a literary figure, the romanticized king in Shakespeare's Cymbeline, into a historical actor whose political behavior can be tracked with considerable precision. It is worth noting that Shakespeare wrote Cymbeline around 1611, setting it loosely in the Roman period but filling it entirely with Elizabethan court politics. The literary Cymbeline and the historical Cyanobelin share almost nothing except a name. Rome had been laying the groundwork inside Britain long before 43 AD. Caesar mentions in the Gallic Wars a man named Mandubratius, the son of a Trinovantes tribal leader whose father had been killed by Cassivellaunus. He fled to Gaul and sought Caesar's protection. Caesar accepted him, installed him as the Trinovantes leader during the second invasion, and pressured Cassivellaunus not to touch him. This is the earliest documented case of a British client king. Recent archaeological survey of Trinovantes territory has led researchers to conclude that Rome had cultivated a network of genuine proxy rulers inside Britain well before the conquest. These were not just leaders who accepted Roman political support from a distance. Some of them had been sent to Rome as political hostages, educated there, and returned home carrying Roman administrative thinking as a toolkit for governing. The immediate trigger for the 43 AD invasion was an internal crisis. After Cyanobelin's death, his 2 sons Caratacus and Togodumnus expanded their power and drove out Verica, the pro-Roman leader of the Atrebates tribe. Verica fled to Rome and appealed directly to Claudius for restoration. For Claudius, this was an extraordinary gift. He was a man who had been sidelined for most of his life because of physical disabilities. He had a limp and a stammer, and the imperial court had long treated him as an embarrassment. He had come to power through a palace coup and desperately needed a military victory to establish his legitimacy. Accepting the appeal of an expelled client king, framing it as a just cause, and leading a campaign personally was a political move of almost perfect simplicity. Claudius did go to Britain in person, but he stayed for only 16 days. In those 16 days, two things happened that mattered to him. He rode a war elephant into Camulodunum, and he received the formal surrender of 11 British tribal leaders. The elephants had been shipped from Africa specifically to produce visual impact. The surrender of the 11 leaders was cast into an inscription and carved onto a triumphal arch in the Roman Forum. Claudius got what he needed and went home, leaving the actual work of conquest to his general Aulus Plautius. There is one more dimension to this story that has only recently been reconstructed systematically. Bioarchaeologists studying late Iron Age skeletal remains from Dorset have applied stable isotope analysis and bone pathology research to those remains, and what they found is unsettling. The first problem was dietary narrowing. As demand for Roman goods increased, certain communities shifted toward large-scale monoculture production in order to generate surplus goods for exchange. This disrupted the balance of micronutrient intake across the population. Bone samples from areas with the most intense contact show statistically measurable deterioration in nutritional status during the 1st century BC, expressed as declining bone density and increased evidence of deficiency-related skeletal pathology. In 2023, a study funded by the Natural Environment Research Council, covering 9 sites across southern England, identified individuals in layers dated between the 1st century BC and 1st century AD, whose strontium and oxygen isotope ratios indicated a Mediterranean geographic origin. These isotope ratios are fixed in tooth enamel during childhood, locked in permanently by the local geology of wherever a person grew up. They cannot be faked, and they do not change. Finding Mediterranean signature individuals in pre-conquest Britain means that people from the Roman world were physically present in Britain before a single soldier landed. Who were they? Merchants, diplomatic staff, craft workers, enslaved people. We cannot say with certainty. But they were there, and they left evidence underground. And they brought with them microbial environments that the local immune systems had never encountered. Rome did not only bring roads and law to Britain. The isotope record shows that decades before the first soldier landed, it had already brought dietary disruption and pathogens the local population had no resistance to. Civilization came as a bundle deal. The side effects were included. In 2022, the Ancient Genomics Laboratory at Cambridge University released a dataset of pre-Roman British genomes. Researchers found several individuals with recent continental European ancestry whose dates correspond closely to the Caesar expeditions and the subsequent period of intensive diplomatic contact. That is not someone arguing a case. That is DNA. Put all of this together, and the year 43 AD changes its meaning entirely. It was not a beginning. It was a formalization, a moment when a much longer process got an official stamp. In the century or more before that date, the elite of southern Britain had already been consuming Roman goods, imitating Roman vessels, stamping Latin onto their coins, borrowing Roman visual symbols to reinforce their own domestic authority, sending their sons to Rome to be educated, and learning through countless diplomatic encounters how to position themselves within the Roman world's frame of reference. Meanwhile, at the level of ordinary households, people had quietly changed how they ate, changed what they used at the table, and changed the microbial environment inside their own bodies. From Pytheas writing the first systematic account of Britain around 325 BC to the landing of the Claudian legions, nearly 400 years passed. In those 400 years, some people used knowledge as a weapon, some used wine jars as tools, some used coins to make political statements, and some paid for all of it with their bodies. When the 4 legions came ashore in Kent, they did not find a world that had no idea who they were. They found a society that already knew their language, had already borrowed their symbols, and in some places had already absorbed their pathogens. The general commanding the invasion, Aulus Plautius, had through years of diplomatic contact already developed a clear picture of the political landscape he was entering. He knew which tribes would resist, which would cooperate, and he had advance intelligence on the military dispositions of Caratacus and Togodumnus. That intelligence came from decades of contact, carried by merchants and envoys and exiles moving back and forth between Britain and Gaul. Caratacus himself held out for years. After losing the east, he retreated west into Wales, joined forces with tribes there, and continued a guerrilla campaign until he was finally captured in 51 AD. He was brought to Rome and delivered a speech before Claudius that Tacitus preserved in the Annals. The argument went something like this: if I had surrendered like an ordinary prisoner, neither my fate nor my name would be worth remembering. But if you spare me, I will be permanent proof of your generosity. Claudius spared him. Tacitus says the speech moved a wide audience in Rome. A man Rome called a barbarian, defeated and in chains, used the conqueror's own logic to argue for his survival, and it worked. That outcome, more than any victory or defeat, captures the fundamental nature of the relationship between Rome and Britain across those long centuries. 43 AD was not the year Rome came to Britain. It was the year Britain stopped pretending it had not already become Roman. And in all the long years before that moment, two worlds had been watching each other, seeping into each other, reshaping each other. Through wine, through coins, through rumor, through bone, through silence, and through lies.